Hello, welcome to the Eugenics podcast. I'm Patrick Merricks.
I'm Marius Turda.
Morning, Marius. Are you well?
I'm very well, thank you. Good morning.
Wonderful. So today we're talking about indigenous populations and their relation to the history of eugenics. Beginning with the story of China's treatment of the Uyghur population. So, what do you want to say about this?
Well, China's long eugenic arm is probing deep into the minority population. And we have this example from the Uyghur Muslim women being sterilized and being subjected to a number of practices that indicate very clearly that the Chinese state is trying to control the fertility of this particular indigenous population and this particular minority group, and is trying through various measures such as forced abortions, sterilizations, institutionalization, to sustain a population policy that favors the majority Chinese population. So this is another example of a long history of how the state intervenes in the private sphere, how the state tries to control minority populations and try to suppress certain groups that it feels are a threat.
So we selected a few examples from history to get some context here. Let's begin with Australia. So who is this figure here? What were the policies towards the indigenous people in Australia?
The Global South provides very interesting examples when it comes to the discussion about indigenous populations in eugenics. So we have Australia, we have New Zealand. Australia is probably more important because the Australian eugenicists were concerned indeed with Aboriginal people. And they did try to prevent marriages between the Aboriginals and the white settlers, what would become Australians, for eugenic reasons. To their credit, New Zealand eugenicists did not really try to prevent and interfere too much with Aboriginal population in New Zealand. But in Australia, we have a more direct approach to the indigenous problem, and particularly the issue of miscegenation, racial crossing. What we have here is it's a very interesting case that relates to some of the conversation we already had. You have a very important feminist reformer and educator, Ruby Ridge, who is, by all accounts, a very important person in the panoply of Australian progressive figures. However, at the same time, as we've seen with other examples, she was very keen to promote eugenics. She was influenced by Francis Galton and other British eugenicists, and she was very keen to work with the Racial Hygiene Association of New South Wales, which she founded, to devise a national family planning network for Australia.
So also there's a long history in Norway and Sweden, Marius.
Yeah, it's important to return to Europe for just a second, because this preoccupation with miscegenation, racial crossing, and indigenous populations, it's something that characterized early eugenic movements, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. So two very powerful examples come from Norway and Sweden, and we have two important Norwegian and Swedish eugenicists, Jon Mjön, who's Norwegian, and Herman Lundborg, who's Swedish. And they were very well known internationally within the international eugenic movement. They were very powerful figure nationally within the Norwegian and Swedish eugenic movements, respectively. And they were very much interested in the Samis, the indigenous population from northern Norway and northern Sweden. And they were very much interested in issues of racial crossing, racial inferiority. Attempts were made by them through their research to separate and argue for a separation of the Nordic Germanic race, as they call it, and the indigenous population. It was assumed by them that even if it is a healthy individual who mates with a person from an inferior race, in this particular case the Samis, that healthy individual would be affected. So racial crossing, bastardization as they call it, was an issue they tried to address. And we have two examples here of the, particularly in the corner right. This is the expedition Jon Arfemjön organized in 1922, and we have him there measuring the head of a Sami woman. So it is very important to remember that the European eugenicists were from early on interested in whatever pockets of indigenous populations were left in Europe. And they tried to separate them out. They tried to control their fertility. They tried to control their future through eugenic means. So that's something that then, of course, we can see happening across the world.
Yeah, so moving now to North America, we have examples from both United States and Canada.
North America is certainly the most known case, again, because of the continuous debate we have about sterilization of indigenous women, both in the United States and in Canada to this day. We hear repeated calls for exposure. We have news about new cases emerging, and people are coming forward to describe what happened to them. If we look at the whole relationship that existed in the United States within what they call the Indian Health Service, then we know that many thousands of Native American women were sterilized throughout the 20th century. Again, interestingly, if we look at the figures, the very worrying figures after the Second War, during the 60s and 70s. So we mentioned this previously when we talked about the sterilization of African American women. That the paradox you have is that some of the intensity of sterilizations occurs in a period when America is actually experiencing an upheaval of social rights and gender rights movements. But the attempt here, as it was in Europe, and it was in the global south, like Australia. On the one hand, you need to separate the white majority from the indigenous population through various measures and to protect the so-called white race or the Nordic race, as was the case in Sweden and Norway. On the other hand, you have an attempt to control the native population, to reduce their birth control, to reduce their birth rate, to measures of birth control. And we can see that very clearly in the case of Canada. Canada, particularly in the provinces of Alberta, where you have the Sexual Sterilization Act introduced in 1928, on the books until 1972, and British Columbia Sexual Sterilization Act introduced in 1933 until 1973. So here we can see very clearly how indigenous women were targeted. They were perceived to be more criminal than the white majority. They were perceived to be poorer. They were perceived to be more mentally defective. In one word, they were deemed to be unfit to be mothers. So we have a number of cases of indigenous women being sterilized. At the same time, what we see is that you have non-legislative sterilization happening. So that is outside the Sterilization Act that legalized sterilization. And this is one example from the 1976 federal inquiry that revealed between 1971 and 1973 for at least 551 indigenous women were sterilized in what are called in northern Canada Indian hospitals. So it's a very complicated history in which all these eugenic arguments about femininity, about sexuality, about indigenous women, about control of reproduction, and the power of the state come together. The modern state, as we know, deals very poorly with issues of difference. They try to homogenize the population. They try to weed out unwanted elements. Luckily, of course, we also have cases, and this is a very powerful example of Leilani Muir, who successfully sued the government of Alberta. She was sterilized when she was barely 11 years old in the 1950s, and found out later when she tried to conceive that she was sterilized. And then she successfully sued the government, and she won. So there is a lot of public activism and vocal reaction criticizing these policies, and people are coming forward. And there is a big public debate, both in Canada and in the United States, about eugenics and about Indigenous populations.
So although the stuff that's happening today is sort of 50 and 100 years apart from some of these historical examples, the policies are startlingly similar, but perhaps the public position and perception is different. So how do the historical examples link to what's happening today for you?
We can see that on the one hand, you have very strong opposition from public figures, and there is a very strong opposition from the general public towards these examples and towards these cases. And China and the Uyghur population, the treatment of the Uyghur population in China attracts a lot of attention. So people even talk about demographic genocide. So we have a widespread concern about the treatment of minorities, the treatment of indigenous populations. But what interests me and what I think is relevant when we talk about the history of eugenics is how much of these practices actually continued throughout the 20th century and unabated in many ways, and how much of the thinking remains embedded not only in the mentality of public functionaries, but also within the very powerful inner core mechanism of states, oppression and state control of population.
Well, once again, Marius, thanks for joining me on an important discussion, and thanks to everyone for watching or listening. So once again, thank you, Marius, and see you next time.
Thank you, Patrick. Till next time.